Very much for being here. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be moderating this panel. I am Pablo García, the Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Chile and the IFC chair. So that's my role as in the statistics of central banks space. I am honored to be moderating this very distinguished panel on the challenges and opportunities of new information, looking at what has been innovative recently and how we can look at the future. Before we start, let me just introduce our panelists. We have Paul Schreyer. He's the Director and Chief Statistician of the OECD Statistics and Data Directorate. He has been at the OECD since 1988 and in the statistics area since 2020. Then we have Bruno Tissot. Bruno is the Head of Statistics and Research Support at the BIS, and he's the Head of the IFC Secretariat. He has been working at the BIS since 2001. Next, we have Maciej Brzezinski. He's the Head of the Data Office at the European Central Bank. Among his primary responsibilities are the development and facilitation of organization-wide data governance, and he has 20 years of central banking experience in many, many areas. And last but not least, we have Ricardo Vicuña, the National Director of our National Institute of Statistics, since just a couple of months ago, but he also has had a very distinguished career at the central bank in the past. He spent a decade and a half in the area of statistics. He was the first division director, actually. And he was the organizer of the first conference that we had in 2015. So I'm sure he's seen this baby grow, and he's quite happy to be here with us. So we will proceed through a number of rounds of comments on different topics. And at the end, if we have time before lunch, we can have also questions from the audience. So the first topic of discussion where we want to hear our panelists have some input is on new sources and digitization. How is the analysis of new sources of information promoted in each of your institutions? What are the new sources and techniques for using information and data particularly innovative compared to what we have done in the past, and promising and relevant for the future? How could artificial intelligence be incorporated into the work of the statistical community? How to achieve a balance between the potential of data sources and data science? And what are the main benefits and challenges of digitization in terms of productivity? These are many, many different angles on the area of new sources and digitization. And you are not forced to answer every single one of them, and maybe you want to take a different angle, but we would be very happy to hear your thoughts on that. So, Paul.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel and getting right into the heart of the matter. As you said, there's a lot of substantive issues here, and I will just address one or two of the things you mentioned. First of all, the use of new sources and data is something that is well established in the work of the OECD. We do have a smart data strategy, and a part of it is explicitly dedicated to the use of new sources in OECD statistical and analytical work. The general idea is that the new sources are very often there to complement the existing data, the existing sources, which are still, the official statistics that we get from members and from other international organizations. But a major function of the new sources is to enhance timeliness, granularity, and spatial diversity of the data that we use for analysis, because as I underlined yesterday already, this is where the big demand comes from. The challenges, certainly in an institutional, from an institutional perspective at the OECD, is that we are operating in a somewhat decentralized statistical system. The different parts of the OECD each have their statistical functions. So harnessing these new sources and data and trying to harmonize their usage to introduce governance, we heard this morning, is something that we are working on. A major issue also is how do we ensure quality assurance processes for the use of new data, both in my own directorate, but also in other parts of the house. Maybe I'll leave it here for the moment and then come back on issues like AI and so on.
Thank you. Bruno.
Yes, many thanks again for inviting me. A lot has been said during the conference, so perhaps I should focus only on a few points, provocative points. I would question the term new sources. In fact, it's not so new. We had all these, for central banks, what is really important is to make use of what we call financial big data. So all the micro data that already existed for many years, that were organic data and that were not used. Same for the text. Text is not new, but the way we can use text with natural processing language or large language models is new. So in fact, what is new is a way to make use of the data, not the data itself. And the second point I wanted to say is that in terms of application, what we have seen is that it's not just the data, the key is to extract insights from this data. Whether they are new or not. And what we have seen is that you have three conditions for success in the central bank's community. You need to have together working people working together from the IT side, from the mathematical, statistical side, the machine learning guys, but also the subject matter experts. If you don't have this combination, either in a single individual or in teams, then the probability is that you will be less successful. So,
thank you. Maciej.
Thank you very much for inviting me as well to this panel and being able to share with you some of my thoughts. Maybe I say a few words about very important in my viewpoint about the communication of the new sources, or not so new sources of information, but how we use them. And here at the ECB we see that this is the groups of people which now enter and want to get some information and data from our sources is really very disparate. So there are people which are completely ignorant and they simply heard something in the TV and they just go and want to, get a little bit more information about one or another thing like inflation, for example, through the students, through the experts, through the researchers. So it's very difficult to satisfy all these needs from these various groups with potentially one tool which we have. So that is the reason why we have a multifaceted approach, and we communicate about data sources and new data sources via multiple channels, and those channels are focused on different groups. And their objective is obviously to get different groups acquainted with what we do. And here I have to say I was thrilled today with the presentation from Banco de Portugal with the Statflix. It's really fantastic, I have to say. And I can only congratulate my colleagues for this, I would say, fantastic idea and implementation it in practice.
Thank you, Pablo. Also, thanks to the organizers of this seminar. For the National Statistics Office, the issue of innovation is critical, and we have it in our strategic planning for the period 22-26. And the idea to innovate in the production of statistics is based on the idea that you need to look for new sources of information that reduce the burden to respondents. Households, firms face a lot of surveys from the national offices, and for production of statistics, you really need to look at another sources that replace this burden to firms and households. And these new sources are basically based on the idea that the states, governments, already have most of the information in their administrative records, and so you should exploit that information instead of again asking the community to provide that information through surveys. Let me give you a couple of examples in which we are developing these administrative records. We are working right now in a project called a new economics units register. This units register is thought to broaden the scope of the frame used to do surveys to economic units based on information from a lot of databases that are already in the government. And second, let me give you an example based on the statistical population register. That is also a new project that we are developing in order to have population records that in the future will help us to replace the way we are doing population censuses. You know that next year we in Chile are having a census, and we are doing a traditional census in which we will survey the complete population. Well, that could be a change in the future if we could exploit a business a statistical population register as the one we are trying to develop right now. I will stop there just to put the idea of the importance of administrative records for the production of statistics.
We actually at the central bank, we've also been developing a lot of new uses for administrative records, but that has led to another issue that some of you have mentioned briefly, but I would like to drill down on that, which is when we have access to all these sources of new or pre-existing but not exploited data, there's a significant challenges in terms of the governance, because there are cybersecurity risks, there are privacy issues, ethical considerations for the use of this data for different approaches. So that means that apart from using all these new sources or pre-existing sources of data, one needs to develop a governance structure. What has been your experience in this sense with this new push towards developing new statistics? I would like to hear your views on that.
That's a very important point, and indeed, you cannot envision an efficient and safe use of new sources without an accompanying governance that is in place. And that has been a little bit our experience as well. At the OECD, we did put, or we have a governance in place now. It was part of the strategy that we developed over the past few years, and I think there were a couple of things that we realized in so doing. The first one was the governance that we put in place is a mixture between sort of a formal governance where you have participants who act like delegates from the various parts of the house, from the various directorates. They represent their directorate and is for the statistical functions. And this is combined with what we call voluntary communities of practice. This is where you bring together people on a demand-based basis from different parts of the house because they share the same issues and problems. So you have a community of practice of people in the house who use R programming or Python programming. You have a community of practice of people who use geospatial data. And they come there because they're interested in this and because they share experience. And these communities of practice is something that is really vibrant and working very well. And so that is the first lesson, that you need those two elements to a functioning governance, especially in regards to the new sources. The second experience is that you need to think through the processes quite carefully that you apply. When you use new sources, you have all different exigencies in terms of the legal constraints, the institutional constraints, confidentiality constraints. People who use these data need to be clear about what the process is that they need to go through for a safe use, for confidentiality protection, and so on. And the third element, which is linked to what I just said, is that somewhat independent of the statistical function, the governance, there is a data protection officer at the OECD whose only job is to express and advise on privacy confidentiality issues, both for the data that we are governed in the sense of data for policy evidence, but also for the data that resides in the OECD as for its management purposes itself. So the distinction that Sandra made very nicely this morning.
Thank you. Bruno.
So we have relatively the same approach at the BIS. Perhaps I would emphasize that this issue of there is no one-size-fits-all model of data governance is very important. Compared central banks with other private firms is different. But even within the central bank, by types of data, the principles can be the same, but the processes, the way to apply them, the indicators, etc., they may be different because and on the statistical side, we should not reinvent the wheel. We have something that we can build on, which is, as mentioned in the case of Brazil, the fundamental principles of official statistics. So, of course, there are all these new challenges with these new sources of data, the way to address them, but at least we have something that is quite relevant. Currently, there is an ongoing people are revisiting a little bit the fundamental principles, but the main conclusion is that they are still very relevant and very helpful. And I would like to finish by the issue with this new data that we were not using before, that we are using now, is how to know your data, how to know the limitation. So data is not the reality, it's just a representation of the reality. We mentioned yesterday the issue of bias or the fact that algorithm on data sets can perpetuate some processes that could be very biased. For example, when you provide credit, if in the past you didn't provide credit to a specific part of the population, using these new techniques will mean that in the future you will continue to have this bias. So the only answer to this issue is to really understand what the data is meaningless in this case, because it's a representation of the reality. Well, again, for statisticians, the answer is metadata, is understanding what the data mean.
Thank you, Bruno.
At the ECB, the data governance, we have like two dimensions of the data governance. One dimension is for our ESCB community, so the community of central banks and national competent authorities, so SSM. And there, of course, we have to ensure that there are certain principles of data management which are observed among all the institutions if we want to build together any kind of common data management platforms. And the second dimension is the institutional inside the dimension of the data governance, when we, I think, have a very similar structure as it was mentioned before. So there is a data committee which is strategically responsible for the decisions on the data management topics, and there is as well the data steward group, which is operationally on the ground executing those policies or guidance which is stemming from the discussion in the data committee. And we have as well the data office, which is responsible to facilitate the entire process inside our institution. And of course, this works pretty well. Of course, it has its challenges, and I think the comment that it's not one size fits all is extremely valid here, because we see that obviously we have a certain challenges which does not appear to in other institutions. And here as well, the exchange and constant collaboration with other central banks, other institutions which are similar to ours, I think is a key to understand what works, what doesn't work, but as well for us to, at the end we have to put our own constraints, and then through these constraints see if the concepts which are working in certain institutions, they have chance as well to work in ours.
Thank you. Ricardo, governance at the INE.
Yeah. Well, when you start working with administrative records, you have to start thinking in the idea that the institution will start receiving and managing administrative records with real identifiers that is data produced within the state. And this requires a lot of being very careful about how you administrate that data, because it's very sensitive data, because the institute is, in a sense, the custodian of information that is with proper identifiers. So for that purpose, you have to establish a given governance. I am glad to listen to the European countries here. I am only the only one in Latin America. So we are lagging well behind the experience of many European countries. So probably what I'm going to say was done many years ago in Europe, but we are just starting. Let me tell you that in the year 2019, we just started with a new data governance unit. And that unit has important responsibilities regarding safeguarding the identified data. This is a small group, but is starting to establish all the processes required to custody this information within the institute. So, for instance, only limited group of people within the institute has access to this data, and that doesn't circulate all over the institution. So that is one issue, governance. And the other one that is probably even more important is information security. And for that purpose, we are also establishing a Department of Information Security since 2019 as well. And this unit is responsible for regulating and creating mechanisms to secure data handling, ensuring compliance with the statistical secrecy law that governs us. So that's more or less the governance. But again, this is a work in progress.
No, the structure of the state is interesting because you have these administrative records in many places across the government, and each of them are very secretive, and therefore there are some basic constraints at sharing information. Sometimes you have to be relatively creative on how to do this and preserve the anonymity, especially in organizations like in our case at the central bank, where we don't have that degree of access to information. So we need to be more creative in terms of making the cross matching and things like that. Now we've talked about new data sources, how to govern those new systems, and the data governance associated with that. And then comes the next step that also was mentioned by a few of you in your previous comments regarding communication. The availability of new data, the construction of new statistics, the significant more demand from the public for new sources of information, the pandemic that created also a number of new sources of data that were sometimes publicly accessed or created by statistical institutions, poses the challenge of how to communicate and how to talk to different audiences about the relevance, the timeliness, the pertinence of these different types of new statistics, so as to avoid particularly the misinterpretation, maybe the spread of fake news, of interpretations that are erroneous compared to what was intended at the beginning. Are these risks that you perceive in your institutions? How do you manage the communication part and the access to different audiences regarding the products, the digital products that you're making?
Maybe I'll start answering by referring to something that Ricardo just said about the desire to reduce the response burden for citizens and firms by, and that so-called once-only principle is something that's being tested out and worked on in a number of countries. The idea being that you only ask once, and then the information is shared between different parts of the administration. Now, there are two conditions for this to work. One is that the various parts of the administration that collect a particular piece of information are then ready to hand it over to the statistical office, which is not always ensured in practice, and I think you just mentioned this. But the second thing is that, in a way, this is a one-way street, because sometimes there's the expectation then that the statistical office would hand back information to the certain parts of the administration. That, of course, is not possible, because it would jeopardize the independence and credibility of the statistical office. So a once-only principle put in place requires also a lot of communication about the role of the statistical office with regard to the other parts of the administration, so that citizens are not under the impression that Big Brother is now watching them, and the statistical office combines all the tax information and so on, and hands it back to the tax office. So there's an important communication aspect to this sort of efficiency aspect that is pursued in many places. That was sort of a little bit of a side remark. In terms of communication, well, we had some really excellent presentations today already. I think for us, the key is that we are moving in a state where we're going from pure dissemination to listening and to engagement. And again, I mean, this was very well explained this morning. It includes also seeking the spaces where people are actually operating, like social media and so on, trying to bring trusted evidence to these places, finding out about users, but also finding out about non-users, understanding why, young people don't go to the OECD website if they want to know, internationally comparable data, that they go somewhere else. Okay, why is this the case? And what can we do differently? Finally, I mean, this idea of statistical offices or central banks, partners in the statistical systems, are the places to go for trusted information is something that in itself needs to be communicated on. So we need to explain what we're doing to preserve or to assure quality. Okay, and I mean, not just putting it out, saying with it, but actually explaining what is happening to do this. And hopefully that will help maintaining this trust.
Thank you. Bruno.
Yeah, I would not resist to react a little bit on data sharing, because IFC has been working a lot on data sharing, and there are several dimensions. There is data sharing issues within the organization, for example, between the supervisory and the policy, monetary policy bodies in the central banks, across domestic institutions like NSO, central banks, private sector providers also, And internationally, the BIS tries to promote international data sharing. We actually have an exchange of confidential data across countries organized by the BIS. And what the report was saying is that all these processes that you were mentioning are extremely important, but it's also very cultural. So it's also simply that silos exist because people do not exchange. So one issue highlighted by this report was really to this cultural dimension and the fact that people should know what the others are doing to try to make progress. On communication, so I will not repeat what has been said. Perhaps one specificity at the BIS is the focus on the long-term view when we communicate to the public or also to the policymakers, because our key public is the central banks. And the idea is that with all this new granular information, there is really a risk that we are overwhelmed by information, and that we focus a lot on specific information and we miss the big picture. So the idea would be how to facilitate, how to help people to see the forest and at the same time the trees that are in the forest. And what we try to do at the BIS is really to have some kind of, so collect granular information that we can zoom in case of needs, but also provide aggregate indicators like deviation of asset prices or the credit indicators that you were mentioning in the case of Brazil, so deviation of credit to some kind of long-term trends. So we have this kind of indicators to facilitate this understanding that yes, something may go wrong at a macro level. You don't really know what. And then, because you say that there is something that may go wrong, you can go deeper into the micro data. But at least you can have the two approaches, because the risk is that if you don't have this macro view, you are lost in the details.
Thank you, Bruno. A check on communication.
Maybe I get back a little bit to data sharing as well, because I would like to ask maybe a little bit provocative question. How far can confidentiality weigh on the efficiency of statistical production, and if we have really this balance right? Because today, confidentiality limits a lot data sharing. And I think we all understand perfectly that reporting agents, they need to get an assurance that the data which they share with us will be used for statistical purposes. But if they get such an assurance, that for me, the data sharing should be by default, and only in exceptional cases we can stop or exclude data sharing. And one maybe additional point to the data sharing, I see as well that usage of these algorithms which can anonymize data, which can use homomorphic encryption, there are still a lot unexplored areas there. And we should, at least in my view, invest to see if employing those algorithms, we cannot really foster and help with the data sharing. And coming back to communication, I think that storytelling, that we based our statistical communication on storytelling with real life examples, that people can get and read and understand what are the consequences of the data which we share with them. I think this is one of the elements which I will add to the puzzle of the communication which we have talked about already a bit during the conference, or maybe more than a bit during the conference.
On the data sharing, I cannot but reflect that there is this paradox that we as users of social media are more than willing to share a lot of data with no concerns at all. But on the other hand, as producers of statistics, the institutions are very concerned that people shouldn't be doing that unless they explicitly say so. So there is a bit of a paradox on human behavior mainly, but
Right.
it's a very good point on the default option. So, and on communications, we have a census coming, and there is a big issue of communication there, of course.
Yeah, sure. Communication for the central, for the, I was going to say central bank. That's my mind betrays me.
Your old self talking.
Yeah, communication for the Office of Statistics is crucial. I mean, you need to segment the public. There are different audiences, so you have to be very clear to which public you are talking to. So that's an exercise that you have to do very carefully. And as a matter of fact, at INE, we have segmented different activities to communicate. For instance, we communicate through public conferences for a broad audience. We have technical conferences for smaller audiences. And even we have some engagement with a very specialized audience. For instance, through a course we started this year on our language, and we were surprised to receive like 4,500 students. We didn't ever imagine that we would have such a big audience with programming language, and this has been a success. That tells you how this type of statistics and this type of area is very popular right now in certain segments. So that's an experience regarding segmenting. But of course, social media is the name of the game right now for certain challenges for the INE. In particular, for instance, thinking about the census of next year, we have developed a special area which is monitoring social media and has different channels to inform the community about all the activities related to the census, because we think that through those mechanisms we can avoid a lot of confusions among the community, and of course we can also communicate a lot of aspects of the census that the community has to know beforehand. So social media, I would say, is critical right now for INE. We have different platforms. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, now called X, etc., and the population and housing census with a special account on each of these platforms.
Thank you. So on communication, it's quite interesting to note that it's not only the supply, from our point of view, on how to create new channels of communication, how to reach different audiences, but it's also aiming, or at least trying to foster an environment where the demand is more knowledgeable, where the communities are more informed about statistics. What you mentioned about the interest on R, I think is very helpful in the sense that, because people need to know about statistics so that they can understand statistics. And you see a challenge there at the educational level and in terms of transmitting uncertainty. These are very, very challenging issues in terms of the communication area. Now, looking ahead, I would like to get you to talk about future challenges. What comes next? What are the things that are most relevant that statistical producers must address in the coming years? And in particular, in your specific institutions, which are the areas that you feel or that you think should be strengthened the most going forward? What is your view?
Well, I don't want to repeat myself what I said yesterday morning, but I think in terms of the substance, the issues around linking those different areas that we've been looking at, like around production, national accounts, with the beyond GDP area, thinking about how we can inject, say, distributional concerns into our macroeconomic aggregates, thinking more about the different types of assets that we want to measure. Those are the things that keep coming back through the big priorities of the policymakers. How to make digitalization visible. I mean, we've heard a number of really good presentations on this, which is a matter of granularity also about international coherence in terms of adopting similar classifications, similar concepts. Otherwise, we won't be able to produce internationally comparable data. So I think there are a number of important developments in terms of substance that we need to follow. In terms of the governance, or in terms of the internal challenges that are posed to us, I think probably the two single most important ones that I see more from a management perspective is managing the change that all this involves in the way that we go about our work, with new sources, with new data, with new institutional arrangements. That managing that change in an efficient way is something that is a real challenge, I think, for all our institutions. Secondly, attracting and retaining the right people and human capital for this. I mean, this is a big issue. We know how difficult it is in today's labor market to attract the right profiles. And there are many things that need to be done to train those people who are in place. And I mean, again, this morning, I mean, the Statflix was a fantastic example of a tool for training also in-house. We also have e-learning tools that we developed, say, for STMX and other things, but a lot of investment needs to go into developing data skills within our organization and maintaining them. And this is not, it's an ongoing effort that, of course, is moving very fast because the technology and the tools are moving very fast too. And sometimes I think the need for investment is not always fully appreciated. So there's also, how should I say, a need for internal communication sometimes towards our front offices and in general to substantiate the need for skills development among staff. Last point on this, I think this is also an area where international cooperation and co-investment can come in. I mean, there's no need for every statistical office to develop its own e-training on certain things if the questions and the tools are similar. And the Portuguese, the Statflix is available in English, is excellent, and it's something that can be used by others as well. And I think there are many opportunities to go down that avenue internationally and by way of cooperating across institutions.
Thank you, Paul. And Bruno.
We start with the second question, which is what is the main priorities? For me, it's just to continue the work on closing the data gaps. So yes, we are saying we have a lot of data, but we are still missing a lot of data that we need to, and this was mentioned this morning, to close the data gaps. We have this international initiative that was initiated after the great financial crisis, Data Gaps Initiative 1, 2, supported by the G20. Now we are in the third phase. We still are missing comparable data on house prices, on commercial residential prices, on non-bank financial intermediation, fintech, and now we are also developing new things in DGI 3 with climate finance. So a lot of work, and statistics is a very slow-moving boat. So even in DGI 1, we launched some data collection globally, and we have still not finished these data collections, for example, on trade repositories, on derivative statistics that the BIS is supposed to aggregate at the global level. It takes a lot of time to finish the job. So for the next 2 decades, I think I have enough.
Plenty of work to be
Yeah.
done.
On the challenge, well, a lot has been said, so I would not like to repeat. Perhaps I could simply highlight one challenge that the BIS has always been putting forward is when we look at financial crisis, it always comes from complacency. So the fact that people are even always saying, well, things are different now, we know better, and we can take more risk, and then you have excessive risk-taking, and then you have something that happens. And perhaps this can happen again, especially because now we become even more complacent because we say, oh, we have all this new data, we have all these new tools, so by definition, we are better informed. But we still know that the unknowns are still there. COVID was a good example. Nobody could expect COVID, but even very technical things like what we saw during the great financial crisis, the dislocation in the forex swap markets. When we saw that, I remember in 2008, we didn't believe the data. We thought, no, it cannot be, because there was, we were sure that there should be some arbitrage, and so we thought, I remember at the BIS, this should go down rapidly, and then it lasted for many years. So this kind of unknowns is very difficult to keep in mind. And the problem is that, in addition, we take policies, especially on financial markets, to change the situation. So, in fact, the underlying situation changed because of the policy you are taking based on the data you have. So, all in all, the risk is really that you are complacent because you think you have a lot of information, but at the end of the day, it may lead to take you more risk based on this false sense of security. And yeah, perhaps I'm wrong, but perhaps we will still need to be cautious looking ahead in terms of risks of crisis.
Well, we've had crises for many, even centuries, and data and statistics have improved significantly. So there's something inherent in the cycle that I think that is relevant. Also, this idea that statistics is a very slow-moving train, and how to change tack when you see these events popping up is quite a challenge, right? It's quite a challenge. So, Maciej, what do you think about future challenges?
When I look for the future challenges, I agree with my colleagues that with most of these challenges, I will add maybe additional elements. And here we had a very interesting session about climate change indicators. And I think that climate change indicators, they need to be consistently used for monetary policy decisions. And today, we still have issues with compute these indicators. Those are complex indicators. There are a number of limitations, and there will be really a challenge to get those indicators to the state when they will really work well for our decision-making monetary policy processes. So this is one of the challenges which I really see here, and it was a very interesting, really super interesting presentations about this. One additional element which was mentioned briefly as well is the standardization for the bank reporting. That it is, we put less burden on banks when they report. So we reduce costs for them as well of reporting, reporting in the different countries or cross-border reporting. And here at the ESCB, we are launching the Integrated Reporting Framework program, which is supposed to help us in going in this direction. Close collaboration with the banking industry is one of the prerequisite for these challenges to really produce results which can be later, which the community and the banking industry can benefit of. So those are elements like semantic integration. It cannot be that everyone under, I don't know, loan understands something different, because we will never ever be able to get to a comprehensive statistics. So this is one of the elements which I think we need to as well invest in and get into the communicate or dialogue with the banking industry to get it really, really right. And then one additional, maybe extreme example, because indeed statistics are moving very slow. A little bit too slow for me, but it's a different topic. But the tools and technology below is moving very fast. And imagine that we have a car, and every half a year, everything changes in that car. No? There is a different place for the steering wheel. There is a different place for switching on lights, and everything you have to learn from the beginning. What do you need to cope with such changes? Of course, the data literacy. You need to have a very good programs which will allow data sciences, generally speaking, people which are dealing with data, to be able to use these tools in an efficient way. Because if they are using these tools not on everyday basis, they are lost. And the price for them to get back and start again with this tool is very high. So the data literacy, but not only from the perspective of the all the elements related to reference data, metadata, but as well from the perspective of tooling and technology which is behind that. And I hope here that soon artificial intelligence will help us and will make it easier for us. And I think there was as well an excellent presentation from the professor from the here from the universities, which shows this picture of the multiple buttons. Let's imagine a future when we don't have these buttons, but we just say what we want, and the artificial intelligence will be able to deliver it to us. So this is the challenges, I think, which I see ahead of us.
Thank you. Thank you. Closing remarks before we go to the floor.
Yes, I would like to put the ball to the ground in terms of the National Statistical Office challenges. I would say that the first one is more than a National Office Statistics challenge, a national statistics challenge for the country as a whole, is to have a law, a statistical law that really gives the authority to the statistical office to receive all these administrative records from the state. So we are working on that for a long time, but it would be very nice that the country really gives a law that allows INE to receive all this data, because then we will be able to integrate information more easily. We are doing it right now, but only on a voluntary fashion. So that's the first challenge. The second one, of course, is to exploit the administrative records that we right now have at the INE. And we are doing several activities and indicators, but of course we should do more on that. Let me give you some examples just to illustrate how we are right now exploiting these records. For instance, we are doing something on labor turnover based on the information provided by the superintendents of pensions. So we receive these administrative records, and then we are allowed to produce an indicator on inflow and outflow of workers in the formal market. So through that administrative records, we are already publishing indicators on turnover of workers since last year. Another area in which we are also exploiting indicators based on administrative records would be the capture of prices through web scraping. So we are right now doing some work on trying to calculate price indexes for certain goods of the CPI based on this technology of web scraping that is basically an automaticized search of data on websites through different mechanical searches for certain products, for instance, technological products, cell phones, tourist packages. All this is, of course, experimental and is used as a contrast for the official indicators. But it's very nice to contrast these two sources of information. We are also using what is called scanner data-derived records, in which companies provide us the whole database of their sales. And for that purpose, INE is already incorporating these huge databases for certain supermarket products in the CPI. That's already incorporated. And of course, that alleviates the supermarkets receiving a person from the INE that goes to survey them. So it is a reduction of the response burden. So just those are a few examples, but of course we would like to do a lot more on administrative records and also on something that we haven't mentioned yet anything about it, but is in the area of, for instance, in satellite images. That is very interesting, the ways we can exploit certain characteristics of these satellite images. For instance, to characterize households in terms of their socioeconomic level. For instance, night images of satellites that can be used to characterize socioeconomically a household. That is something very new that can be done with the use of satellite images. Finally, I would say that is also a challenge, Paul also already mentioned, is how this new information is worked within the institute or the organization. Because this brings a lot of challenges on the way you have to face the work, the type of skills you need to have, the type of TI departments, etc., etc. So there are a lot of challenges of organizational aspects that are brought when you start thinking of new sources of information.
Thank you, Ricardo. You brought up satellite imagery, and I remember seeing a study that showed that GDP estimates using that data are closely aligned to official statistics in democracies, but less so in non-democratic states, which is interesting as a contrasting view. Okay, so we have still a few minutes, and we can open the floor to questions from the audience. Maybe we can take a couple of questions and again get our panelists some final remarks regarding those.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Eduardo. I'm with the Central Bank. Very interesting conversation. So, as a user of new information, of new data, I want all the data I can get, right? All the information is not enough for us as researchers. However, I guess my question was, as a producer of this information, as a user of social media, etc., I'm exposed, I generate a lot of information and data. So my question for the panel, for all of you is, where do we draw a line as to, or where do we exercise restraint to the point where we stop looking for more data? Because for like a private institution, that's easy, right? We want to all the information we can get. But for us as public institutions, I'm guessing there's a point where we should stop and say, do we really need, I don't know, this specificity of data, this private information? So I wanted to ask about the panel about that on your view. Thank you.
Thank you. So, is there such a thing as too much data? Maybe we can start the opposite way. Maybe.
Yeah. I would say that the answer goes basically evaluating user needs. The statistical offices are financed by public resources, and the main purposes is to satisfy the demands of the public. So, of course, we would like to do everything as we can to satisfy users, but of course there's a limit in terms of budget. So in order to determine the limit, I would say first, listen users, and second, do a cost-benefit analysis in which you can finally define if it's worth disaggregating already known data at an extremely high cost, rather than using the same resources to improve the quality of our more used statistics. So it's not that difficult if you think it that way.
Good economist answer, right? Good.
I very much agree, to be honest, and I don't see this very different from the private sector companies. We have to do a cost-benefit analysis, and we have to see if the effort which we put in computing whatever additional indicators is worth the benefit of having it. So for me, there is not much difference here, and this will be my answer.
Well, I would emphasize the point on priorities and refer again to the Data Gaps initiative, because it was not something that was led by the international organization. It was supported by us, but it was also led by the countries themselves, the G20, and also non-G20 countries that wanted to be with us. And the main purpose was really to say, okay, we have limited resources, we need to prioritize, and we need to do this in a collective way because it's a global economy. And as you mentioned, the outcome was, yes, we have to focus on climate change. Yes, we have to focus on inequalities. So, and this is very important to have this prioritization exercise. On your point that too much data, it depends. It depends because think of COVID. There are data sets that were not useful, but suddenly we were in the dark because we didn't have surveys, unemployment surveys, etc. And then you had to switch to these alternative data sets. Today, do we need this data? No. But we need to have the possibility to explore the data in case of need. This is a concept of a kind of statistical buffer in case of need. So you should never say, never I will look into this data. You never know what could happen.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to what has been said here. Assessing the priorities and the relevance is something that is an ongoing process, and it's another thing where we need to think about governance. Okay, I mean, how do we actually have a useful process in place so as to determine the priorities and to drop the things that we don't need to do any further. I mean, you mentioned the Data Gaps initiative. That's a good example, actually, where a lot of advice comes from the policy domain and then helps us putting things in place. And I think there's a question of how can we keep this up as we go forward. And the other point that you made, Bruno, about the need to being able to respond to these shocks like COVID, and suddenly demand for things that weren't there before is very relevant too. But again, we need to maintain a certain capacity to switch things on and off as we go forward. During COVID, the OECD put in place a weekly GDP tracker for its countries. That was really useful at that time because all the things were going all over the place. Well, today it's much less important to have some sort of weekly estimate of GDP. And, but the question is now, what do we do with the skills and the capacity that we built up to produce this? Okay, we don't want to lose it because, yeah, the next thing may be just around the corner, so we want to preserve that. But at the same time, it's not very efficient to keep producing something that may be of lesser relevance as we speak. So I think there's an ongoing conversation to be had at which are the topics that we want to put forward and which are the capabilities that we need to preserve on an ongoing basis.
So it's interesting because looking at it from a purely economic point of view, it's clear that the supply is upward sloping. The supply, because it's the demand for statistics in the end has to be met by a supply of human capital that is able to understand and produce. Big tech actually has a big impact on this because when you go to the job market for economists and you try to recruit, the market has changed massively compared to 10 years ago because the big techs, they have all this data, they don't know what to do about it, so they hire highly skilled human capital to then process it and create sort of valuable products for the private sector. So the slope is upward sloping. So it clearly goes up, therefore the cost is increasing. So I think we have time for one last question.
I have a question to Maciej Brzezinski. How to achieve a balance between the potential of data sources and data science while also considering cybersecurity, ethics, and data privacy issues? Also at the European Central Bank, you have to work with data from many countries. So my question is, how do you manage the data governance in this case? Is it is independent from each country, or are you trying to have one centralized unit? Thank you.
It's a complex, very complex question, and it's a complex governance question as well. So I am not 100% sure if I will be able to answer this in a couple of minutes. But in practice, we are currently, as I mentioned, we are trying to build a common data management platform. When these things which you were mentioning, they can be standardized. Because of course we are getting aggregated data. There are a lot of discussion about the confidential statistical information and who can have access to this data, who cannot have access to this data. Users which needs to justify why they want to have access to particular data sets and even particular part of the data sets. And now, because those data sets are owned by the ESCB in practice and are collected by the ECB, that means as well that there is a not unified governance for these different data sets. And of course, it produces certain challenges. You can imagine that one data set is managed or governed in the one way and the second in slightly different way, which obviously does not add to simplicity. So the simple answer is it's complex. And of course, from the IT perspective, our colleagues are doing at most to secure access to data using different type of available technologies. With what means in practice that we have a warehouse with a pretty complex roles model which allows certain being it units or individual people having access to a data sets, of course for the purpose of the production of statistics. So I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you very much, Maciej. And with 1 minute and 36 seconds left, I think we have covered a lot of ground. I want to thank you all for your very deep thoughts. This is being recorded, so I'm sure it will be a reference for the future. and we'll see in the future if all these thoughts about what's coming actually played out and how we face all these challenges. So before we give the floor to Gloria for closing remarks, let's just give our panelists a round of applause.